I have a rule. Actually, I have several rules. Rule 1. Do not get involved in other people's problems. Rule 2. When you see men with weapons in a dark alley, walk the other direction. Rule 3. Do not let your father's 20 years of highly illegal self-defense training write a check your mouth cannot cash. I broke all 3 rules on a Thursday. A Thursday. I had jollof rice in my bag. I was going home. And somehow I ended up standing over 2 unconscious men while a third one ran like I was something sent from a place he did not want to think about. The man bleeding on the ground looked up at me and said, "My father sent you." I said, "Sir, nobody sent me. I just really did not want to watch you die in front of me." He passed out before I finished the sentence. And that, bestie, is how my life ended and something completely unhinged began. Welcome to DOM Romance Stories. Please like, share, subscribe, and tell me where you are watching from, because you are going to want to be here for this. My name is Jade, 26 years old. Admin assistant at a logistics company that has a very specific idea of what my skills are worth, and that idea is wrong, but we are not here to talk about that. I have a 1-room apartment on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator has a personal vendetta against Tuesdays, and the landlord, Mr. Peterson, has developed an entire lifestyle around not seeing me when I need something. I have 2 best friends named Bree and Toya who are the most chaotic people I have ever loved and who I would absolutely not call in a crisis because their version of helping and the dictionary definition of helping have never once been in the same room together. I have a father named Solomon Say who calls me every Sunday and asks about my tomatoes. Not my career. Not my romantic situation. My tomatoes. Because Solomon Say is a man who believes that a person who can keep a living thing alive has their priorities correctly arranged and everything else is secondary. I grow tomatoes on my windowsill. There are currently 3. The left one is struggling and I have complicated feelings about it. And then there is Kwame. Kwame worked on the same floor, different department, and had decided sometime around my 3rd week at this job that I was the most entertaining target in the building. It started the way these things always start, which is small and deniable. My lunch disappeared from the break room fridge with a frequency that could not be accidental. My chair got adjusted so low every morning that I spent the first 10 minutes of every workday looking like a toddler who had wandered into a board meeting. My name mispronounced loudly and deliberately in front of everyone even though my name is Jade, which has exactly 2 letters and 1 sound, and I genuinely do not understand how someone constructs an alternate pronunciation from that, but Kwame found one. He called me Jada. Every single day. Jada. With confidence. Like he had workshopped it. Then came the comments about my weight, my hair, the way I dressed, always delivered with a big smile, as if the smile was a receipt proving he had not done anything wrong. Now here is the thing about me and Kwame that Kwame did not know. I could have ended Kwame's particular season of entertainment in approximately 4 seconds flat. I know exactly what I am capable of because 3 years ago a man named Dennis followed me to my car in a parking lot and made a comment about my body for the 3rd time, and I handled Dennis. Dennis spent 6 weeks in hospital. I spent 4 months paying medical bills that were not my fault, navigating a legal situation where every single person in that room looked at me and saw the problem first and the victim somewhere much further down the list. And losing a job I had actually liked because the environment became impossible. I had walked away from that with a very precise understanding of how the world scored my self-defense differently from everybody else's. So I let Kwame talk. I breathed through it. I moved my chair back up every morning without a word. I took the long way home on the evenings I spotted him lingering near the bus stop. My self-control in the presence of Kwame was honestly one of the most impressive ongoing achievements of my adult life. Someone should have given me a certificate. Framed. On a wall. That was what I was doing the Thursday my life became unhinged. Taking the long way home. Kwame had been stationed near the bus stop with 2 of his friends in a formation that was trying to look casual and was not casual at all. I clocked him from half a block away, turned left instead of right, put my headphones in, tucked my container of leftover jollof rice under my arm, and started the extra 20 minutes through the quieter streets behind the commercial district. I was listening to a podcast about people whose problems were considerably larger than mine and feeling appropriately grateful about my life. The tomato on the left was on my mind. It needed more sun possibly. I was going to assess the windowsill angle when I got home. And then I heard it. That sound. The particular sound of something heavy connecting with something that used to resist and no longer does. From around the corner of a narrow side street. I should have kept walking. Every sensible instinct I had said, keep walking, Jade, keep walking. This is not your business, you have rice. You have a tomato to check on, keep walking. I told my feet this clearly. My feet had already stopped. My feet had, in fact, already turned toward the sound. My feet and my brain have been in conflict since I was 7 years old, and my feet have an alarming win rate. I came around the corner and there were 3 men in an alley. One had a blade held low at his side with the ease of someone who kept blades the way other people kept pens, just something you reached for without thinking. One was standing over a figure on the ground with the focused posture of a man finishing a job. The third was watching the entrance, and he saw me the exact same second I saw him. He moved toward me immediately, hand up, palm flat. Back up, he said in Korean. I understood Korean. My father had made absolutely sure of that, along with several other things that would become relevant shortly. Wrong alley, the man said. Walk away. I looked past him. The man on the ground was on one knee, trying to get upright and not quite making it, his face turned partially toward me. Through the blood, I could see his jaw. And I want to tell you that in that moment, I was thinking about strategy and tactics and the moral calculus of civilian intervention. What I was actually thinking was that whoever this man was, he had the most aggressively structured jawline I had ever seen in my life, and it seemed a genuine waste for it to be bleeding on an alley floor. Which is not a useful thought. I am aware. I was not in charge of my thoughts in that moment. His arms were shaking where they pressed into the ground. His shirt had been white and expensive once, possibly earlier that same evening, and was now telling a completely different story. His dark eyes were open and calculating even now, even from the ground, like some part of him was still running numbers on the situation. I took my headphones out. I set my Jollof rice down against the wall gently and with intention, because I was raised correctly even in chaotic situations. I looked at the man in front of me. He was broad. The kind of broad that came from years of being the biggest person in every room and having everyone behave accordingly. He looked at me in my braids and my cardigan and my extremely ordinary Thursday night clothes, and he made a calculation about what I was and was not capable of. I watched him make it. He made it wrong. That was genuinely his only mistake. Let me tell you about my father. Solomon Say, late 50s, compact and quiet, a man who grew tomatoes and called me every Sunday and lived 3 hours away in a small house that smelled like soil and something always cooking. Before the house and the garden and the Sunday calls, Solomon Say had been someone considerably more complicated. He had been part of a world that I would come to understand much better than I ever wanted to. He had left it 22 years ago, left it deliberately and completely, walked away with nothing except his grief and his daughter and a decision. The decision was this. His daughter would never be helpless. Not to anything. Not to anyone. Not ever. He called it self-defense. He started when I was 7. By the time I was 12, he had quietly brought in 3 of his old friends to supplement what he could teach alone, men who knew things that did not have polite names. By the time I was 18, I had learned things that I understood even then were not self-defense in any ordinary sense of the word. They were something else. Something my father needed to call self-defense, because calling it what it actually was would have meant explaining why it was necessary. And explaining why it was necessary would have meant telling me about my mother, and about the world he came from, and he was not ready. He called it self-defense for 22 years straight. Every lesson. Every drill. Every correction. Self-defense, Jade. Just making sure you are safe. And I let him call it that because I loved him, and I could see what it cost him, and some things do not need to be named out loud to be understood. So when the man in that alley put his hand out to stop me, he had no idea. He genuinely had no idea. What happened next took less than 40 seconds and was not cinematic. Real skill is not cinematic. Real skill is efficient and contained and looks almost boring to someone who does not understand what they are watching. The first man, the one who had come toward me, went down in 4 seconds. Wrist controlled, weight used against him, Pressure applied to a specific place in a specific way that my father's friend Mr. Cho had spent 3 weeks making sure I could find in the dark. He hit the floor and did not get back up. The second man, the one with the blade, had turned toward me with it raised, and I was already past his reach before he finished the motion. The blade hit the alley floor. He joined it shortly afterward and considerably less gracefully. I straightened up. The third man looked at his 2 companions on the ground. He looked at the knife nobody was holding anymore. He looked at me standing in the middle of the alley in a dusty pink cardigan, not even breathing hard. And then he grabbed one of the fallen men by the arm and started moving with the energy of someone who had just made a very clear and final life decision. The second man pulled himself upright enough to assist. They were out of that alley in under 20 seconds. Gone. Just gone. Running like the alley itself was something they needed distance from. The quiet that came after was very complete. I looked down at the man on the ground. He was staring up at me from one knee where he had made it to at some point during the proceedings, blood on his temple and his lip and his collar, white shirt completely beyond saving, and his expression was not the expression I expected. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was calculation. Even now, kneeling on an alley floor with blood on his face, he was running something. His dark eyes moved over me with the specific attention of a man filing things. And then he said, "My father sent you." I said, "Nobody sent me. I was going home." He said, "My father sent you." I said, "Sir, I had jollof rice in my bag." I turned left because there is a man at my office named Kwame who is standing near my bus stop. I was trying to get home. "You are welcome for the thing I just did." He opened his mouth. And then something in him that had been holding on through sheer will made a final decision, and the alley tilted under him, and he went sideways, and the ground came up, and he was unconscious before I could finish what I was going to say next. Which was fine. Probably better. I crouched down beside him and checked his pulse with 2 fingers the way Mr. Cho had taught me. 2 fingers, side of the neck, count to 3. Steady. His chest was rising and falling in the regular way of someone who is not in immediate crisis. The cut on his temple had slowed. He needed stitches and probably a full medical workup, but he was not dying tonight. I sat back on my heels. I looked at him. I looked at the alley entrance. I looked at him again. I said out loud to nobody, "I cannot leave him here." And somewhere in my head, every reasonable part of me was saying, "Jade, yes you can, you absolutely can. This is the exact situation walking away was designed for." And my father's voice underneath all of that said, "You know what you would think of yourself if you walked away from an injured person in an alley," and I did not have a good answer to that, so I stayed. I went through his pockets quickly because I needed options, and I was not going to be precious about it. No wallet, which I noted. Locked phone. A small matte black card with a single phone number on it, and nothing else. A ring on his right hand, dark metal, some kind of seal pressed into it that I did not recognize. I looked at the card. I looked at him. I looked at my rice going cold against the wall. I dialed the number from my own phone. It rang twice. A voice answered. Male. Clipped. The voice of someone who had been answering calls like this for years. "Yes," I said. "The man whose pocket this number was in is unconscious in an alley behind the Sungwon commercial district. Head wound. At least 2 broken ribs based on his breathing pattern before he went down. He is alive. Come get him." I gave the address. I ended the call. Then I retrieved my jollof rice, sat down on an overturned crate, and waited. Because Solomon Say had raised me to be a lot of things, and the kind of person who abandons unconscious strangers in alleys was not one of them. Also, I will be completely honest, I was a little bit curious about who was coming. 8 minutes. 2 matte black cars with no lights moving with quiet coordinated purpose. 4 men got out with the energy of people who had a protocol for exactly this and were running it. The one closest to me had his hand disappearing into his jacket before he had fully cleared the car door, and I stood up from my crate and said, calmly, "If that hand comes out with something in it, you are going to have a very bad next 10 seconds. I am the person who called you. I am not your problem." He looked at me. He looked at the hand. The hand came out empty. Good. We understood each other. They worked fast. Professional. The kind of fast that came from doing this before. One of them turned to me when they had the unconscious man loaded and said, "Who are you?" I said, "Nobody. I was passing by." He looked at the scuff marks on the alley floor. He looked at the wall. He looked at the spot where two people had been lying and were now absent. He looked at me holding a takeaway container in a pink cardigan. He said, "You should come with us." I said I should go home. My rice is getting cold. I picked up my container and I left. I walked home. I ate my rice at my kitchen table. I checked on the left tomato and told it that whatever it was going through, we were going to get through it together. I went to bed. I told myself that was the end of it. One strange Thursday. A story I was going to take to my grave. Absolutely not tell Bree, and especially not tell Toya, because Toya would make it a TikTok within 20 minutes and somehow it would end up on the news. I thought about that jawline for 11 consecutive days. I was not pleased with myself about it. If you are still with me right now, you already know you are not going anywhere. Subscribe. Like this video. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done because I genuinely want to know. Would you have kept walking? Be honest. Stay here because what comes next is where this story starts genuinely getting out of hand. Now, while I was home eating rice and having a completely normal reaction to a completely normal Thursday, on the other side of the city something was happening that I did not know about and would not know about for several more days. His name was Kang, 28 years old. The heir to the Kang line, which is not the kind of name you Google because it is not the kind of name that appears on Google results. The Kang name existed in the places that do not get written down. In back rooms and precinct hallways, and the particular silence that fell in certain conversations when someone said it too directly. 3 police districts had a specific protocol for calls involving Kang territory, and that protocol essentially amounted to wait, breathe, and then call someone with a higher clearance. His father, Day One Kang, had spent 30 years building something that presented to the world as a business empire and was considerably more layered than that underneath. Ren was the only son. The designated continuation of everything his father had constructed. The city knew his face from charity events and business columns. The city did not know his function. The people who knew his function made sure to know very little else. Ren had been in that alley on a Thursday evening because he had been careless. That was the honest answer, and it was one he would never say out loud. He had sent his driver away 2 blocks early because he wanted 10 minutes of walking that belonged to nobody but himself, no security, no eyes, no weight of being Kang in every room. He had done it before. He had done it several times before without consequence. That Thursday, consequence arrived in the form of 3 men from the Shin faction who had known his exact route, which meant someone had told them. Which was a piece of information he had filed into the cold calculating part of his mind even while they were hitting him, because that was how Kang functioned. You could be actively bleeding on an alley floor and some part of him would still be running the numbers. And then I had appeared. I would find out later that his first thought, through the blood and the cracked ribs and the fairly reasonable conclusion that this was probably it, was that his father had sent me. Some shadow operative. A woman who looked exactly like someone taking the long way home and moved like someone who had been assembled specifically for moments like this one. He had believed this even while losing consciousness, which I find simultaneously flattering and mildly irritating. I am simply a person whose father had feelings about preparedness. In the days that followed, while I was going to work and breathing through Kwame calling me Jada and talking to my struggling tomato, Kang was doing 2 things. He was sitting across from his father in a room where the air had the texture of a conversation that had been postponed too long, and he was finding me. Day One Kang was 61 years old. The kind of face that had watched everything for 3 decades and returned nothing. He sat in a private room while a medic finished with Ren's head wound and said nothing until the door closed. Then he said, 3 men from the Shin faction knew your route. Ren said yes. Day One said, you walked alone. Ren said nothing because there was nothing that improved the situation by saying it. Day One said, someone in this building told them where you would be. The temperature did not change. Something in the air did. And then, quiet and precise, Day One said, the woman. Ren told him what he knew. She was not one of ours. She called the emergency line from her own phone, gave her location without being asked, sat down and waited, told the security team her rice was getting cold, and walked away without giving a name. She put 2 of the Shin faction's men down. Efficiently. The kind of training that is not accidental. Day 1 said, "Find her." Ren said, "I know." His father said, "Find out who she is before I do." There was a weight to that sentence that Ren understood completely. Find her first in his father's language meant protect her from the version of this where I find her instead. It took Ren 4 days to find me. It would have been 2, but I had given no name and the number I had called from was registered to a logistics company. His people traced it to an employee who worked on the 3rd floor and took the long way home on Thursdays. He read my file the way I imagine he read everything, completely and with no expression. 26 years old. 1 apartment. 1 civil case 3 years ago. 2 HR complaints from a colleague, both dismissed. 1 pot of tomatoes on the windowsill. He told me later that he read the tomatoes detail twice. I told him that was an odd thing to dwell on. He said, "A woman who puts down 2 armed men and then goes home to talk to her tomatoes is not an ordinary file." I did not have a response to that, so I ate my tteokbokki. My route home on Fridays took me past Mrs. Beck's Pojangmaka. A small red and yellow street tent with plastic chairs and a woman behind the counter who had been making tteokbokki in the same spot for 20 years and missed absolutely nothing. I went almost every Friday. I always sat in the same chair, the one at the end with the slightly bent leg that rocked if you shifted, and I ate alone with my headphones in and existed in the specific piece of a ritual that belonged entirely to me. It was my thing. My small, uncomplicated weekly joy. 3 weeks after the alley, I was in my chair with my headphones in, minding my business with genuine commitment, and someone sat down across from me. I looked up, and my body went completely still in the way bodies go still when they recognize something before the brain has finished its paperwork. I had been right that I would know his face cleaned up. I had thought about it enough times in 11 days to have a fairly detailed internal reference. What I had not accounted for was the difference between imagining a face and having it 3 feet away from you across a small plastic table. He was sharper in person. The jaw even more unreasonably structured. Dark eyes that landed on things and stayed, the kind that were currently landed on me with the focused attention of someone who had been looking for something and had found it. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and sitting with the posture of a man who had never once in his life walked into a room and felt unwelcome, not because he was arrogant, but because rooms simply did not do that to him. He just existed in spaces, and the spaces sorted themselves out. I inhaled a piece of tteokbokki. I want to be clear that this was a physiological response to surprise and had nothing to do with his face. I choked on it for several seconds that felt considerably longer than they were while the heir to the most feared name in 3 districts sat across from me and watched with an expression of complete composed patience. He did not offer to help. He just waited for me to resolve my own tteokbokki situation. Which I did. Eventually. With what dignity remained. I took my headphones out. I looked at him. I looked at my bowl. I said, "You found me." He said, "You were not trying to hide." I said, "Fair. How are your ribs?" He said, 2 fractured. 1 cracked. 12 stitches on the head wound. I said, "Good." And I picked up my chopsticks and kept eating because I was not going to let him make this moment more dramatic than it needed to be. From behind the tent flap, Mrs. Beck appeared, looked at him, looked at me, looked at the situation, and disappeared again with the efficiency of a woman who had filed something important and would be addressing it shortly. I did not like the way she looked at the situation. That was a Mrs. Beck who has made a decision look, and historically nothing easy had ever followed it. He said, "I want to know your name." I said, "Jade." I kept eating. He said, "Jade." Like he was putting it somewhere permanent. Then he said, "I owe you." I said, "You do not." I did not do it for you. I did it because I physically cannot watch someone get killed in front of me, which is a personal flaw I have accepted. There is no debt between us. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are people who need to understand that what happened in that alley was not acceptable." I looked at him. "You think someone gave them your route?" I said. He said, "Yes." I said, "And you are here telling me this because they traced the call," he said. "They know someone intervened. They do not have your name yet. But they are looking. And while they are looking, you are not safe." I put my chopsticks down. I looked at him with the particular quality of attention that my father had spent years building in me, the kind that sees the thing underneath the thing. I said, "So by helping you I made myself a target." He said, "Yes." "I am sorry." I said, "Are you going to fix it?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Then sit down properly because you are half hovering and it is making Mrs. Beck nervous, and when Mrs. Beck gets nervous she starts managing people's personal lives, and I cannot afford that right now." He sat down properly. Mrs. Beck materialized a second cup from somewhere and vanished again with suspicious speed. I looked at where she had been. I looked at the cup. I had been coming to this tent for 2 years. Mrs. Beck had never once brought an extra cup without being asked. I made a mental note about this and filed it under developing situations. He watched me eat in a way that should have been weird, but somehow was not, which was itself the kind of thing I was not going to examine too closely at a street food tent on a Friday evening. I said eventually, without looking up, "I grew up around people from your kind of world. I know what you are. I am not afraid of you. But my life stays mine. Whatever you are handling, you handle it. And then this is done." He said, "Understood." I said, "And the man at my office. Kwame. I am not asking you to do anything about him. I am simply making a factual observation about my working environment. I want to be very clear that I am not asking." He said, "Noted." I said, "You say noted in a way that makes me deeply uncomfortable." He said nothing, which made me more uncomfortable. I finished my food. I said goodnight. I walked home. I told myself I was not thinking about him. I thought about him the whole way home and once more before I fell asleep, and I was annoyed at myself about it, but not surprised, because apparently this was who I was now. Drop a comment right now telling me if you felt that tension through the screen, because I need to know I was not alone in that. Like this video. Subscribe if you have not. And keep watching because the comfortable part of this story is now officially over. The following weeks had a surface that looked like my normal life and an underneath that was anything but. I went to work. I filed documents. I answered phones. Kwame called me Jada 7 times in 1 week, which was a personal record, and I breathed through every single one of them with the composure of a person who had made a spiritual practice out of not reacting. I watered my tomatoes. The left one was still struggling, and I was taking it personally. I called my father on Sunday, and he asked about the tomatoes, and I said the left one was not thriving, and he said, "Too much water, Jade, you always give them too much water, you got this from your mother, she drowned every single plant she ever tried to grow." And I laughed a real laugh and did not tell him about the alley. I almost told him twice. Both times I picked up my phone and looked at his contact and thought about his voice and what it would do with that information, and I put the phone back down. What I did not know was that the Shin faction had already found the phone number. Not my name. Not yet. But the number. They knew a woman had been in that alley. They knew she had called Kang security and stayed until they arrived and then walked away giving nothing. They were turning over every available rock because they had decided, with the impeccable logic of dangerous men who had never once considered the mundane explanation for anything, that this woman was a professional. A shadow asset. Someone the Kang family had deployed and was pretending not to know. The possibility that she was a 26-year-old admin assistant who had taken the long way home because of a man named Kwame had simply not entered their working theory. I found this both offensive and deeply funny when I found out about it later. Like, yes, the legendary Kang family shadow operative goes home to argue with her tomatoes. Very intimidating. Very covert. Rand knew they were looking. His people were watching them look. He came back to Mrs. Beck's the following Friday. I was in the chair. He sat down. I pulled one earbud out and said, "They found the number." He went still. He said, "How did you know that?" I said, "This chair has been empty for 6 consecutive Fridays, and now you are in it. You are not here for the taekbaki. You came to tell me something you did not want to say by phone, which means it is worse than last time." I looked at him. "How much time do I have?" He said, "Enough. They do not have your name yet. My people are between them and the number." I said, "But eventually." He said, "I am going to end this before eventually becomes relevant." Mrs. Beck brought 2 cups and a plate of extras I had not ordered and gave me a look that said she had formed a position on this situation and her position was favorable. I gave her a look back that said, "Mrs. Beck, please." She went back behind the tent flap humming. Humming. The woman was genuinely humming. 2 years of Friday visits, and this woman had never once hummed in my presence, and now she was humming, and I knew exactly what it meant, and I did not have the bandwidth to address it. Ren looked toward the tent. He said, "Does she always do that?" I said, "She has never done it once in her life until tonight." He picked up his cup. Something moved across his face that lived in the neighborhood of a smile without fully committing to it. We sat there, and after a while I said, "Ask me something real." He said, "Why do you let Kwame talk? You are clearly not someone who has a problem handling a person like that." And that question landed in exactly the right place, the way his questions had a way of doing. I looked at him for a moment and said, 3 years ago I put someone in hospital. Someone who had earned it thoroughly. And I paid for it for 2 years in every direction. I know what I am capable of, and I also know that the world does not weigh a black woman defending herself the same way it weighs other people doing the same thing. So I calculate. Every single day I calculate what is worth the cost. Kwame is not worth the cost. He said, "That is a very expensive way to live." I said, "Yes." "Now you tell me something real." He said, "What do you want to know?" I said, "The person who gave them your route. Someone inside your circle." He was quiet. I waited. He said, "I have a strong suspicion." I said, "Someone close." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is the worst kind of knowing. When the knowing is certain, but you have not finished deciding what to do with it yet." He looked at me when I said that, and the something between us that had been building in the space between these red plastic chairs moved again, larger this time, and neither of us reached for it. Not yet. I ate my tekbaki. He drank his tea. Mrs. Beck hummed behind the tent flap. The city moved around us and had no idea. Now here is the part that none of us knew yet. Not me, not Ren, and not Solomon Say sitting in his garden 3 hours away minding his actual business. The Shin faction had not picked that alley at random. Their history with the Kang name went back decades, back to when the alliances in this city were drawn differently and the men drawing them were considerably younger. Day One Kang and the head of the Shin faction had once been on the same side of a particular line and had separated over something that was never properly resolved, and that unresolved thing had been accumulating for 27 years with interest. And what nobody had told me, what I was about to find out in the worst possible way, was that my father's name was in that history. That Solomon Say, who grew tomatoes and called me every Sunday and had spent 22 years being the quietest version of himself possible, had once existed in that same world. That he had left it. And that the people he had left had not forgotten his name. On a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after the first Friday at Mrs. Beck's, my phone rang with an unknown number, and I answered it because something in me said to, and I have learned to listen to that something. Ran. His voice had a different register than I had heard it before, focused and fast. He said, "Go somewhere safe right now. Not your apartment." The cold arrived clean and immediate. I said, "What happened?" He said, "They found your father's name in the trail. They have traced the training back to him. They are moving." And that was the moment the comedy in my chest stopped. I stood up from my desk, which caused Kwame to look up from across the room with an expression of curiosity that I did not have one single second for. And I looked at Kwame with a look that had about 20 years of Solomon Say's training in it, and Kwame found something extremely interesting on his computer screen and stayed there. I gathered my bag. I said to Ren, "Are your people already moving toward him?" He said, "Already moving. Your father is not going to be touched. I promise you." I said, "Ren Kang." I said it very quietly and very precisely. "If anything happens to my father because I chose to help you in that alley, you and I are going to have a very different kind of conversation, and it will not go the way things typically go for you. Do you understand me?" There was a pause. Then he said, "I understand. Nothing will happen to him. Where are you?" I told him. I went downstairs. 3 minutes later a matte black car pulled to the curb, and he got out of it himself, not a driver, not a security detail, him, before the car had fully stopped. And his eyes found me on the pavement immediately, and something in his posture that had been wound very tight released a fraction when he saw I was standing and whole. I noted that. I filed it. I got in the car. He said, your father is safe. My people reached him first. I exhaled. Slowly. I pressed both hands flat on my thighs the way I did when I was managing something large from the inside. He drove. I looked out the window at the city being completely ordinary around us. After a long moment I said, he is going to know who you are. Ren said yes. I said, and your world is going to become visible to him in ways he has been very carefully avoiding. Ren said yes. And then he said, there is something I need to tell you. About your father. About my father. About why the alley was not the coincidence it looked like. I turned my head and looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. I said, tell me. He told me. Solomon Say and Daewon Kang had once existed in the same world. The night my mother died had a connection to the Shin faction that my father had never told me about. The debt between the families was older than both Ren and me. When I turned that corner on a Thursday with jollof rice under my arm, I had not accidentally stumbled into a stranger's problem. I had walked directly into 22 years of history that had been waiting for me to arrive. The car was quiet for a while. Then I said, he called it self-defense. Ren said nothing. I said, 22 years. Every single lesson. Self-defense, Jade. Just making sure you are safe. He spent my entire childhood building me for something he was never going to tell me was coming. I stared at the city moving past the window, the perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening city where people were doing perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening things. I said, quietly, he never said a word. Rin said, he was protecting you. I said, I know that. I pressed my fingers to the edge of the window. I know that. That does not make it easier to sit here and understand that I've been a contingency plan since I was 7 years old and nobody told me. He drove. The silence between us had the quality of silence that holds something real in it, the kind that does not need filling. He took me to a property that looked like an ordinary apartment building and was absolutely not one, checked every room with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to be certain. And I watched him do it and said nothing about what it meant that he was doing it himself. He stopped at the door. I was in the middle of the room. He looked at me. He said, you will be safe here. I said, I know. He said, I am going to handle all of it. The faction. The inside source. The exposure to your father. I said, I know. He said, Jade. I said, what? He stopped. Something moved through his face, something that was not the controlled expression, not the calculation, something underneath both of those that lived in him before the world taught him to manage it. He said, I am sorry. That you're in this because of me. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, you did not put me in that alley. I walked there myself. She paused. And I would do it again. I said the last part quietly, and he did not look away from it, and something settled between us that had the weight of a thing decided without words, and we both felt it. And we both left it there because neither of us was ready to open that door completely yet, and we both knew the other one knew that. He left. I called my father. Do not scroll. Do not move. Stay right here because what my father is about to say to me rewrote everything I thought I understood, and I need you subscribed and present for this. Like this video. Drop a comment. Stay. Dad answered on the first ring. He said, are you safe? I said yes. Then I said, Appa. Just that word. The Korean word for father that I had used my whole life because of men whose language my father had made sure I learned, and that word opened the conversation differently than any other word could have. He was quiet. I said, I know about you and Daewon Kang. I know about the history. I know what the training was. Tell me the rest. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear his garden. The specific evening sounds of a place I had grown up calling safe. Then he said, your mother was not in the wrong place at the wrong time, Jade. She was with me. At something she did not fully understand the nature of. I was still in that world. I had been trying to leave it for months, and I had not finished leaving, and she died in the distance between trying and done. He stopped. The Shin faction was part of what I was leaving. They knew I was going, and they did not want me to go with what I knew. The fight that night was not an accident. I sat down on the floor. Right there on the floor of the safe house. He said, I have known this your entire life. I said, and you trained me because you knew it would find me eventually. He said, I trained you because I could not survive in a world where what happened to your mother happened to you. I could not stay in that world. I could not make it not real. So I gave you the only thing I had. He stopped. Then he said, I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I kept waiting for a moment, and the moment never came, and then too many years had passed, and the longer I waited the harder it was to start. I sat on the floor for a moment. Then I said, and Ren Kang, his son. You did not think at any point to mention that the world was eventually going to produce him in my direction. My father said, I did not know he would be in an alley specifically. I said, Dad. He said, I knew Day One had a son. I knew if the world found you, it would find you through something connected to that family. I thought I had more time. He paused. How is he? I said, he has a spreadsheet where his personality should be. My father made a sound that was almost a laugh. He said, his father was the same way. His mother fixed it eventually. He paused. Your mother would have had strong opinions about his jaw. I said, Dad. He said, I am simply observing. I said, I am not discussing his jaw with you. He said, I did not bring up the jaw. You did. I said, I did not bring up the jaw. He said, you said it is a spreadsheet where his personality should be, which means you noticed there is a jaw to be a spreadsheet next to. I sat there for a moment. I said, good night, Dad. He said, water the tomatoes less. I said, the left one has a fruit now. He said, despite your best efforts. I said, good night. I put the phone down and laughed for the first time in about 2 weeks, and it felt like something releasing a grip it had kept very tight. If you are still here, I love you, and also you should subscribe and like this video and leave a comment, because I am going to need the support for what comes next. Keep watching. What happened in the week that followed happened fast. Ren confirmed the inside source, a man named Park Hyun-woo who had been embedded in Kang's security logistics for 7 years and turned through a manufactured debt. Patient and deeply placed, and almost impossible to find without the specific thread that my phone call and my father's name had given his intelligence team to pull. Park Hyun-woo was handled in the way things in Ren's world got handled, which I did not ask about and he did not describe, and we had a mutual silent agreement that this was the correct division of information. The Shin faction's leadership received something considerably more lasting than a physical visit. Documents. Recordings. The kind of material that made regulatory bodies and certain federal agencies very interested in having urgent conversations. Day One Kang had spent 30 years building exactly this kind of leverage on exactly this kind of opponent, and Ren deployed a precise portion of it. The faction did not collapse overnight, but its leadership became immediately and completely occupied with problems that had nothing to do with the Kang family and everything to do with their own survival. The threat to my father and to me dissolved because the hands directing it were suddenly full. Rin called on a Wednesday evening and said it was done. I said thank you. He said, I will come to you. I said no. Friday. Mrs. Beck's. The regular time. He paused and then said, I will be there. He was there. I was in the chair with the bent leg. Mrs. Beck brought 2 cups and a full extra plate before we had settled and gave me a look of such personal satisfaction that I had to physically look away from it. She said, under her breath, but absolutely loud enough for both of us to hear, finally. Then she went back behind the flap humming. Rin looked at where she had gone. I said, she is doing this on purpose. He said, clearly. I said, she has decided something about us. He said, when did she decide? I said, the second Friday you sat in that chair. He said, and what did she decide? I said, she decided that it was already settled and we just had not caught up yet. He looked at the tent flap. Something moved across his face. I kept eating. After a while he said, your father wants to meet me. I put my chopsticks down. I said, my father has not said anything to me about wanting to meet you. He said, your father called my father. I stared at him. I said, Solomon Say called Day One Kang. He said yes. 40 minutes. I sat with that. 40 minutes. My father, who had built a quiet life out of maximum distance from that world, had spent 40 minutes on the phone with Day One Kang. I said, what did they talk about? He said, I was not told specifically. But my father said, and I am quoting, the Say girl has her father's instincts. I looked at him. I said, the Say girl. He said, It was a compliment. His father does not use adjectives carelessly. I thought about this for a moment and then started laughing. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere surprised and genuine. Ren watched me laugh and his face did something I had not seen it do before, open and warm and unmanaged, and Mrs. Beck came through the tent flap, looked at us, said to herself, "Yes, good, exactly," and went back inside. That was the night we talked properly. Not about the faction or the threat or any of it, just talked the way people talk when the managed distance between them has gotten tired of being maintained. He told me something small and honest about himself that he had not told anyone, the kind of thing you only say when you have stopped performing. I told him something back. The evening moved. The street noise moved around us. At some point I shifted in the chair and it rocked on its bent leg and I grabbed the table edge and his hand was there before I finished the motion, covering mine, and neither of us moved. I looked at our hands. I looked at him. He was looking at me with the face underneath the face, completely his, completely unguarded, and he said, quietly, "I am not good at this. I am good at most things. I am not good at this." I said, "At what?" He said, "At wanting something I cannot calculate." I turned my hand under his so we were properly holding and said, "Me neither." He said, "Are you afraid?" I said, "Of you?" "No." "Of this?" "A little." He said, "Me too." I said, "Good. That means we are both paying attention." Mrs. Beck came out to refill our cups, looked at our hands, looked at him, looked at me, and said something in fast Korean that translated to "I have been watching you too since the very first cup and I knew and I want credit," and went back inside. I called after her, "Mrs. Beck, I am going to need you to manage your reactions." She said, "I have been managing them for 6 weeks. I am done managing them. Tonight I celebrate." I looked at Ren. He was doing the smile. The real one. The full unguarded one that lived in him before the world taught him to keep it in back rooms. I had not seen it before. It changed his whole face. It was deeply inconvenient. I looked at the street. He said, "You are looking away." I said, "I am observing the street." He said, "Jade." I said, "The street is very interesting." He said, "Jade." I turned back. He was still smiling. I said, "That is not fair to deploy on people." He said, "I will keep that in mind." We stayed until Mrs. Beck closed the tent, which had never happened in 2 years of Fridays. She shooed us out with the energy of a woman who had accomplished something and told us to come back next week. He walked me to my building. We stood outside where the lobby light fell across the left side of his face, and I looked at him the way I had stopped pretending I was not going to look at him, and he looked back and I said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and I went inside, and he stood on the pavement for a moment and then walked to his car. He texted me when he got to the car. It said, "Your tomato." The left one. "How is it?" I took a photo. The small determined fruit on the tentative stem. One word. Surviving. His response came in 30 seconds. "I know the feeling." I kept that text. I did not examine why too closely. If you have watched this far and you are not subscribed, I say this with complete love. What are you doing? Subscribe. Like. Comment. Tell me the moment that got you because I want to know. Stay. The months that came after were not without chaos because my life had apparently decided that chaos was its default setting now. There was the matter of Ren's father, who wanted to meet me. There was the matter of my own father, who had resumed a 22-year communication blackout specifically to involve himself in my situation, which I found both touching and absolutely on brand for Solomon Say. And there was Bree and Toya, who had by this point figured out something was happening because I had been humming at work, apparently, and Bree had taken this as a crisis requiring immediate investigation. Bree cornered me on a Tuesday. She said, "Who is he?" I said, "What?" She said, "Jade, you have been humming. You do not hum. The last time you hummed was 2019 when you got an unexpected refund, and even that was only for about 4 minutes. This is different humming. This is a situation." I said, "I have always been a person who hums." She said, "You have never in your life been a person who hums." Toya appeared from the kitchen corner where she had been waiting in ambush, which I should have anticipated because Toya has been conducting ambushes since we were 17, and she held up her phone and said, "Is this him?" On the screen was a photo of Ren at some formal event. Dark suit. That face. That jaw making whatever decisions it makes. I said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "The internet, Jade. The man is not invisible." She zoomed in. She said, "Bestie." I said, "Toya." She said, "Bestie." Bree looked at the phone, looked at me, looked at the phone again and said, "Jade say." Just that. Like she needed a moment. Then she said, "Does he know you argue with your tomatoes?" I said, "We are not discussing this." Toya had already started a new group chat on her phone. I said, "Toya, what is that called?" She turned the screen around. It said The Situation. I said, "You made a group chat called The Situation." She said, "This is a group chat situation, Jade. This is exactly what that feature was invented for." I went back to my desk. I did not engage with the situation group chat. I read every single message in it. Toya sent 17 questions over the following week for mood boards that I will admit were well-researched, and a document she had written herself titled Practical Considerations for Dating Someone Whose Father Runs an Empire, which included as its first point, maintain your own bag always, and as its third point, do not let the bodyguards intimidate you. You are the main character. Bree responded to the document with one word. Accurate. I maintained my dignity throughout. I also watered my tomatoes and the left one produced a second small fruit and I chose to take that as a sign. The meeting with Day One Kang happened the week after the Friday at Mrs. Beck's when things between Run and me stopped being something we were pretending not to notice. Bree said wear the black and do not apologize for anything. I wore the black. I walked into that building the way Solomon Say had spent my entire childhood teaching me to walk into any difficult room, spine straight, face composed. The expression that said I have already run the numbers and I am here because I chose to be here and not for any other reason. Ren met me in the lobby. He looked at me and said, "You look like you are walking into a negotiation." I said, "I am walking into a negotiation." He said, "My father is not your enemy." I said, "Not yet. But he is also not yet my ally, and I will treat this accordingly. That is how your father raised you too." He did not argue. Day One Kang was not what I had expected, and was exactly what I had expected at the same time. I had prepared for power that needed you to know it had arrived. What I found was a man who sat the way mountains sit, not performing weight, but simply having it. He looked at me the way Ren looked at things, finding the thing underneath the thing. I looked back at him with equal attention and did not blink first. He said, "Sit down." I sat. Ren sat beside me. Day One poured tea and pushed mine toward me before his own, and I noted it and filed it. He said, "Your father is Solomon Say." I said, "Yes." He said, "Solomon Say walked away from this world 22 years ago and took nothing." I respected that. It is one of the few clean exits I have ever seen. I said, "It cost him." He said, "Yes. Everything clean costs something." He looked at me steadily. "You put two of the Shin faction's men on the ground in an alley and then sat on a crate and told my security team your rice was getting cold." I said, "I was hungry." Something moved in Day One Kang's face that had not moved there in a very long time. He said, "Your father trained you well." I said, "My father trained me to survive. Not to be useful to anyone. I want to be clear about that." He said, "I am clear." He told me about the debt. "Your mother died in something that came from choices I made and did not make," he said. "I was not directly responsible, but I was not clean. Solomon knows this. I have known it for 22 years. It has sat in the silence between us." I kept my face careful because this was the conversation that had been underneath every other conversation since the night in the car when Rin told me the truth. He said, "I would like to resolve it." I said, "I am listening." He named his terms. The Say name under Kang protection going forward. My father's quiet life completely untouched. And me, continuing to be exactly who I am, which he said his son had already decided was non-negotiable. I looked at Ren. Ren was looking at the table with the expression of a man who had decided not to comment on his father's last sentence and was sticking to that decision firmly. I looked back at Day One. I said, "And in return." He said, "Nothing. This is not a transaction. It is a resolution." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "My father trusted you once." He never said so directly, but I know Solomon say, and I know the difference between real regard and tolerance. I will take the resolution. The rest of it we will see. He said, that is a fair answer. I said, I know. Something moved in his expression that looked like approval. He picked up his tea. I picked up mine. Ren exhaled beside me with the specific energy of a man setting something down. After the meeting, walking back through the lobby, Ren said, you said the rest of it we will see. I said, yes. He said, about us. I said, about everything. I am not telling your father what I have decided about you before I have finished deciding. He said, and have you finished? I said, ask me in a few weeks. He stopped walking. He turned and looked at me in the middle of his father's lobby and said, I am not waiting a few weeks. I said, then stop calculating everything and say the actual thing. He said, the actual thing is that I have thought about you every single day since a Thursday alley, and I ran the calculation 17 times, and it keeps producing the same answer, and the answer is you, and I do not know how to be more direct than that without it turning into a spreadsheet. I looked at him. I said, that was the least spreadsheet thing you have ever said. He said, I know. It took considerable effort. I walked up to him and said, I have been irritated about your jaw since the night I checked your pulse in that alley, and that is the honest answer. He looked at me for one more moment and then said my name, quiet and certain, and I answered. And what happened in the lobby of the Kang building in front of one very professional receptionist who found his computer screen extremely interesting for the following 2 minutes was the beginning of the only thing I had not planned for and was not going to calculate my way around. Rand drove me home afterward. I said, the receptionist saw everything. He said, he is very discreet. I said, he is going to tell people. Ren said, 3. Maximum 3. I said, Ren. He said, possibly 4. I put my face in my hands. He said, Jade. I said, what? He was doing the smile. I said, you cannot just use that whenever you need to win an argument. He said, I am not using it strategically. I said, it feels strategic. He said, it is genuine. I said, that is worse. He laughed. The full chest kind. I looked out the window and smiled at the city and did not let him see it, which he absolutely saw. The proposal happened on a Sunday. It was not grand because he had learned by then that grand would require me to process it for 3 to 5 business days, and he did not want to wait. I had brought my tomatoes to his apartment because the left one had 3 fruits now and his east-facing floor-to-ceiling windows were objectively superior tomato real estate. He had said bring the tomatoes the way he always said it, like it was obvious, like of course the tomatoes were welcome, and I had stopped being surprised by it somewhere around the 4th time and started just bringing them. I was adjusting the pot angle on the low table by the window when he said my name. I said, the light is better from the side. He said, Jade. I looked up. He was in the middle of the room with his hands in his pockets and the face underneath the face, and he said, I want you here. Not the tomatoes. You. All the time. In every room. Not because of alleys or debts or history. Because you set your jollof rice down against a wall before you handled 3 armed men, and then sat on a crate and told my security team it was getting cold. Because you argue with your tomatoes. Because you call your father every Sunday. Because you looked at me like I was a spreadsheet and stayed in the chair anyway. He paused. I want to be alive with you. He took one hand out of his pocket. A ring. Simple. Dark metal. No ceremony. Just a thing chosen with complete intention. He said, if you want to. I looked at the ring. I looked at him. I said, of course I want to. He said, that was fast. I said, I finished deciding 5 Fridays ago. I was waiting for you to arrive. He said, you could have told me. I said, you could have asked sooner. He put the ring on my finger. I looked at it. I said, it is the right weight. He said, what does that mean? I said, some rings feel like decoration. This one feels like it means something. He said, it does. I said, I know. He pulled me in and I went and we stood in the morning light coming through his east-facing windows with the tomatoes and the rabbit on the low table, and it was, simply and completely, enough. I called Bree first because if she found out through Toya I would never hear the end of it. She screamed. A full genuine architectural scream. Then I need to see the ring immediately. I sent the photo. 43 emojis in rapid succession, telling a complete emotional story. Then I am calling Toya. I said, please wait 5 minutes. She had already called Toya. I could hear it starting. I put the phone down and looked at Ren. He said, how bad? I said, Toya has opened a new group chat. He said, what is it called? I checked. I said, the resolution. He looked at the name for a moment. He said, she is not wrong. I said, do not tell her that. She will make it into a lifestyle brand. He said, is that a problem? I said, Rin, Toya once turned a cancelled coffee order into a 20-minute video essay. He nodded slowly. He said, noted. I said, you keep saying noted. He said, I keep meaning it. I called my father. He answered on the first ring. He said, how are the tomatoes? I said, Dad. He said, how are the tomatoes? I said, the tomatoes are fine. The tomatoes have company coming in about 7 months. He was quiet. I said, we are thinking about a name. He said, and? I said, Solomon. The quiet that followed was the kind that holds a whole life in it, all the years and the cost and the love that survived the cost. He said, Solomon. I said, yes. He said, your tomato. The left one. I said, 6 fruits now, Dad. He said, too much water. I said, definitely too much water. He said, it survived anyway. I said, it survived anyway. He said goodnight. I said goodnight, Dad. I love you. He said, I know. Which had always been his way of saying it back. I put the phone down and looked at the morning light coming through the east-facing windows and the tomato pots on the low table with their 6 determined fruits and the ceramic rabbit sitting between them, moved from the shelf months ago and never returned to it. I thought about alleys and Thursdays and the specific relief of a steady pulse under 2 fingers in the dark. I thought about red plastic chairs and Mrs. Beck humming and Bree screaming and Toya and her group chats and my father who called it self-defense for 22 years because he loved me in the most complete and practical way a person can love another person. I thought about a man who drove 3 hours on a Saturday morning without telling me and said the actual thing in a lobby and kept a ceramic rabbit because his mother gave it to him when he was 7 and laughed with his whole chest and looked at me like I was the answer to a calculation he had stopped trying to solve. I went to make tea. The morning continued. The city moved outside the windows. And somewhere 3 hours away, Solomon Say sat in his garden and looked at his phone and felt the particular quality of a man whose work is finished and whose rest is earned, and thought, there it is. There it is. If you made it to the end of this story, I need you to know that I see you and I appreciate you more than I can say. Like this video. Subscribe to this channel right now. Share this story with someone who needs something that feels like something today. Drop a comment below and tell me your favorite moment because I read them all and I want to know. And if you are new here, welcome. We tell stories that feel like something. We will see you in the next one.